In terms of, I guess, secondhand fandom, growing up with your dad's soccer team, and then building your own allegiances through the Champions League or whatever it might be. Is that a generational shift, or has fandom always worked that way? We just call it something else now?
I think the exclusivity of distribution in the past forced us to a certain allegiance. Okay. So putting aside anything inherited from family or community, right? Because your dad took you to the first game and that's how you fell in love, right? I mean, that's a very romantic way of thinking about it, but not everybody falls into fandom like that. And as a matter of fact, in Venezuela, that baseball was a number one sport. Sometimes in the same household, you have conflicting fandoms, right? So I think you stumble upon fandom in different ways. What is true, though, is that those ways were more limited in the past. And today, you have multiple ways of inheriting, of stumbling into fandom. It could be inherited, right? Or it could be discovered. I think the mix, if you were to look at a timeline, right? I think fandom was inherited. I would say, I'm going to make up the numbers because empirically I don't know, but I would say 60 years ago, 50 years ago, when the NFL started and all this, 95, because it never was 195% of the fandom is inherited. And as distribution platforms have grown, right? Radio and then TV and then color TV and then live TV, because there was TV, but there wasn't live, and then cable TV, right, which allows you to watch multiple, and then satellite TV, which allows you to watch it wherever, and then streaming and all that. What that has done is being able to discover it more, right? So I think that mix of inherited versus discovered has changed, and I would venture to say it's going to turn more towards discover than inherited.
That's really interesting. So I guess, from your perspective, in your role and within the business, how do you plan for that in the future? Like, how is this really impacting on the decisions that you guys are making as you're thinking about, the audiences today and the audiences you're going to be encountering over the years to come?
I think you have to have a dual bet, right? You have to cater to the sports and the fans and the audiences that you have today, without and putting bets on long-term plays, right? I mean, on things that might be discovered by people along the way. It's for sure more expensive to get into kind of, let's pick three sports that have become a little bit bigger: paddle, pickle, and lacrosse. You can probably enter those sports from a distribution standpoint on a very cheap ticket vis-a-vis the other sports. Um, so you probably can start doing bets on that and see, like, if the sport grows and more people discover it, then maybe you have a raw diamond in your hand.
Super interesting. And from that perspective, I guess, again, in your shoes, where do local and global fandom strategies actually come into conflict? And how do you resolve that as you're planning?
This is what I think, but you can have multiple perspectives here. I think it will revolve around authenticity, right? I think when something becomes too global, it risks losing what made it special locally, right? But on the flip side, if something stays too local, it limits the growth. You would ask, then what is the solution, right? Again, if I had the formula, like, if it were that easy, right? I mean, if it were that easy to have that perfect balance like the Yankees have, which is extremely local, right? But you can go to any country in the world and somebody's wearing a New York Yankees hat, right? Probably people that have never watched the game, right? Because there is association of that brand with something that goes beyond the sport, that it's global, yet it's so locally rooted, right? Because if you're a Yankees fan, you're not a Mets fan, and I think the solution is in compromise. It's preservation, right? Uh, I think you try to scale the experience without diluting the identity that was created in the first place. And I don't think there's a perfect formula for that, but that's, I would think, the vision that you would have to have.
And if fandom without borders becomes, I guess, the defining frame for the next decade of sports and media, what does the industry need to stop doing? And what does it need to start doing to help accommodate that?
And for industry, you mean the sports industry or the media industry?
I mean, both in terms of, sports generally, but also, the broadcast element to it and I guess the media that wraps around it.
I think that's where some of these things might be at a conflict, right? Because I think as a league or as a team, you need to understand that there's a huge potential that goes beyond the borders of your local geographic constraints. And you need to also acknowledge that there is a huge world beyond your traditional demographic constraints, right? What do I mean about that? The geographic is easy to think about, right? Uh, the demographic it's a little bit more complicated, right? The geographic one, you need to think beyond where you are, right? And acknowledge that to the extent that you can distribute your content more widely, it's easier for people to make connections with your content and your league. Demographic, if you are an owner of a soccer team, it's easier to break through with Hispanics for whom soccer is probably like religion than with your typical Midwestern American that is more attached to American football and American football and baseball or whatever it is. The problem is, and I think the easiest example is to think with a very simple exercise, which is let's go about ticket prices, right? To the extent that you go to the soccer fans as a soccer club, you're going to be able to increase soccer prices. And if you continue digging that demographic, that group of people, you're going to be able to increase and increase and increase and increase. The problem is that you're alienating a large amount of people that probably would want to experience going to a game, but they are not as big fans. They don't understand the sport, and they might not be willing to pay that high ticket price. So how do you combine those two things? How do you make sure that a person that is not a fan of the NFL is able to afford taking his entire family for a Sunday game, right? Because that's the way you grow that group, but it goes at the expense of losing money on this other one. The same example goes with media, right? To which extent do I sell my rights to the highest bidder versus just putting it as broadly as possible? And on my end, to which extent I continue paying as much money for all these leagues and at the same time save some money to bet on these other ones that might be up and coming, right? Again, I think that's if there was a formula, roles like mine would not exist, right? Because it becomes formulaic and you just decide how to allocate your resources, and you wouldn't have business development groups or distribution or partnership groups and leagues and teams to be able to reach out or ticketing and manage ticketing yields because it's not perfect. I mean, you just need to balance all these elements as fandom changes and as the plans of you as a team change. Because again, if you're only extracting the majority, if you only want to extract the majority of the economic value, then maybe it's at odds with growing your fan base.